Hello and welcome everyone today to today's presentation. My name is Kelly Hendrickson. I am the Director of Community Outreach, and I am here representing SouthBayFamiliesConnected.org. And we are so grateful and would love to thank our partner, Beach Cities Health District, and our partner schools across the South Bay to come together and put on this wonderful presentation this morning. We always invite you to visit us at southbayfamilies.org for a host of resources that are developed for parent education and empowerment, all in our efforts to help our youth thrive. And with that, I'll turn it over to Allie, the Director of Youth Services for Beach Cities Health District.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank all of you for being here for this special lunchtime presentation of the Families Connected Speaker Series. Again, my name is Allie Stewart, and I'm the Director of Youth Services here at Beach Cities Health District. And in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, we're very pleased to have Dr. Dan Siegel here to give a presentation over this lunch hour. I'd also like to thank our school partners. We offer the Families Connected Speaker Series in collaboration with South Bay Families Connected and the school districts in Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, and Redondo Beach. So we thank them for their partnership, and happy to see so many families from those school districts here today. A little bit more about Dr. Siegel. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine, and he's the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He is also the executive director of the Mindsight Institute, which focuses on the development of mindsight, teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel has published extensively for both professional and lay audiences, including 5 New York Times bestsellers. Those resources, as well as other educational programs, can be found on his website, drdansiegel.com and mindsightinstitute.com. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to Dr. Siegel.
Thank you so much for being here and for inviting me to join with you to really look at what connections have to do with mental health. We're going to explore a number of things that have to do with the parenting experience. And when we do that, what we have an opportunity to do is, if we are parents of very young children, to think about something called attachment, which is how our relationships directly impact the development of our child. As our kids get to be older, and mine are now in their late 20s and early 30s, we have an opportunity when they go to school to actually support them as they start going out into the world. And then as they become adolescents and their development really shifts, we have an opportunity also to continue being attachment figures and support them in a different kind of way. And then when they become older adolescents and out of the house, and then even young adults, we continue to be active in their lives. So in many ways, this talk is all about parenting, and it's about looking at a way to use science to actually say, what is the mind of a child truly? How can you as a parent, whatever the age of your child is, from the earliest times of infancy all the way into later adolescence and early adulthood, what can you do as a parent to build on science to draw on the positive ways in which we know you can support healthy growth and development? So to do that, because we have people present who have children of these various ages, let's just say a couple of very general points about what development really means. So we have, the experience of change across a lifespan, and that's what the word development refers to. But how do you as a parent actually influence the development of your child? So you may say, well, it's the genes that I've given to them, or, if I'm an adoptive parent, it's the genes that the sperm and egg of their, birth parents gave to them. And I use the word birth parents rather than biological parents because if you are a foster parent or an adoptive parent, we need to say that you are a biological parent. because relationships are biology. And so when we are in relationship, when we're in connection with communication and caring, that's a relationship, we actually are shaping the development of the child, whatever their age. So let's look at how that in fact happens. Why would an adoptive or foster parent also be a biological parent? And a lot of times when I work with adoptive or foster parents, they'll say, oh, I'm not the biological parent. And I go, no, excuse me. Actually, you are. Because the genes we receive through the sperm and the egg, those are one part of what shapes something called our temperament. But then what happens is experience becomes a dominant way in which the child's way of being in the world will be influenced. Now, how does that happen? Well, it turns out that when you look at ways we connect with our kids as parents, there are basically energy patterns that are called communication, that depending on how those communication tendencies we have go, we can show in the field I'm trained in, attachment research, that the outcome for a child will be this way if you tend to communicate in a certain pattern, or it will go in a different direction if you communicate in a different way. So then you might be asking yourself, well, if Dan is saying communication shapes development, which is exactly what I'm saying, what is communication? And communication is how we connect with energy and information flow sharing. It's basically how, right now, for example, I can say a word like attachment or a word like love, and that's happening through sound. In this case, we're going through the medium of a microphone picking up the sound coming from my voice box here. And that sound is then being translated through these wires into a form that doesn't sound anything like sound or isn't like sound, but then it gets reinterpreted in the speaker of your device as sound. And that's a form of energy. And if I say attachment, it means one thing. If I say love, it might mean another. If I say neglect, it might mean another. If I say abuse, it might mean another. And those are all aspects, attachment, love, neglect, abuse, of patterns of communication we're going to talk about now that shape the development of the child. Now, you might say, okay, fine. Communication is how we share energy and information flow, like right now. What are the patterns that help development of the child be, you can use a number of words, optimized, or if you think about it, let's pause for a moment and do an experiential exercise. Whatever the age of your child is, if I were to say to you right now, what is the outcome you want for how your child, whatever their age, develops? So let's pause for a moment and think about that. What's the outcome that you would like your parenting to influence your child? It's not going to be 100% of how your child turns out, but it will be a significant impact. What would you like? So think about it. And if you have some paper in front of you, you can write the word or two down. And then if I say, okay, if your goal, let's say, is for your child to be, some people might write caring. Some people might write smart. Some people might write happy. Some people might write successful. Some people might write moral. These are all words parents, when I've done this exercise in person, have come up with. So then we could say, okay, if you want your child to be, let's say, kind or wise, do we know anything about parenting from research that tells us what might help a child be that way? And the answer is yes, we do. And if you say, well, I want my child to be healthy and happy, do we know anything from science that tells us how that might turn out? And the answer is yes, we do. So now what I'm going to do is give you that science. But before I do that, I'm going to dive a little more deeply into this word communication, which is energy and information sharing, and just give you a very brief dive into what we mean by developmental influence or developmental impact. The way you communicate with your child will influence how their brain becomes activated in the moment. Let me repeat that. The way you communicate, the way you share energy and information is going to influence, number one, how the brain of your child becomes activated. What that means is how energy flow will be flowing across the neurons, the basic cells of the child's brain, and its connection throughout the whole body. So I use the term the embodied brain. The second thing to say is that with repeated neural firing, that activation of the brain that's stimulated by the way you communicate will actually lead to growth of the brain in particular ways. So, in other words, in the moment, the way you communicate gets the brain of your child to activate in certain patterns. But that activation, especially when it's repeated, will actually turn on genes. And when we say turn on genes, it means we get those genes to be expressed into the production of protein. And that leads to the growth of connections, altering not just the activity of the brain in the moment, but the structure of the brain in the long run. So to repeat that, your parenting is very important on top of the genetic influences that the sperm and egg have given and that lead in a big way to temperament. That's independent of these experiences. But on top of temperament and genetic influences, your patterns of communication then stimulate the brain's activity in the moment. And with repeated experiences, that activity becomes brain structure. So now some parents hear this and they get very upset and they say, oh my God, the pressure is on me so much to create the exact kind of connections in the brain. How am I going to do that? And I'll ask you to take a nice deep breath and say that there is a general movement of the child's brain towards something called integration, which is how different areas get linked together. And some of that growth of the brain's connections are based on genetic information that's already there. Some of that is going to be based on activity of the brain that you are helping create. And some of that is going to be happening as your child finds a way to adapt to what's going on. So there are lots of factors. And the good news is that we have the opportunity to learn these patterns that are helpful and try to unlearn and not do the patterns that are harmful. So let's indicate which is which so that you will have a choice. Do you want your child's brain to grow in integrative ways, which, as you'll see in a moment, are leading to positive outcomes? Or do you want to engage in ways of interacting with your child that lead to non-integrative ways the brain is both activated and developing its structure? So whether you look at, a 9-month-old or a 9-year-old or a 19-year-old, we can say that the journey of that brain's development is to have its different parts become differentiated, that is, that they're specialized or unique in how they start operating. But then what happens is you want to link those differentiated areas together. And the word we're going to use for that we should commit to memory is the word integration. So integration in the brain, it turns out, is the basis of everything we mentioned: kindness, intelligence, focused attention, the way you regulate your emotion and mood so you can be happy, morality, the way you conduct yourself in relationships, all of these things and many more. It turns out relate to integration in the brain. And we know what kinds of parenting support the growth of integration in the brain. So at this moment in our gathering together, we can say, okay, the take-home lesson that I've gotten from Dan is that integration is the basis of thriving. It's the basis of resilience. It's the basis of well-being. It's the basis of happiness. It's the basis of health. And if you think this is too simple to be true, I think the same thing. So I had 18 interns work with me when I was revising a textbook I wrote called The Developing Mind, from its second edition into its third edition. And if you want to see the science, just read the third edition of The Developing Mind. Now, in that journey with those 18 interns, I said to them, how could it be so simple that integration is well-being? And that the following statement must be too simple to be true, I told them. And I said, find one study that goes against this statement. And they couldn't even find one study. So this looks like it's true with, a deep effort to try to disprove it. But it's a basic hypothesis that you may think, like I have in the past, this is ridiculously simple. How could it be this true? But here's how it goes. Relational integration, that we'll define in a moment. Relational integration leads to brain integration, which is the basis of all regulation, which allows for people to flourish and be resilient and be happy. Relational integration leads to neural integration. Now, you may go, that is ridiculously simple. And I'll say, yeah. But we couldn't find one study to go against it. And we found tons of studies to go with it. Just to take 30 seconds and geek out with you a little bit. Every study of well-being every measure of well-being that a certain study of the brain looked for found one predictor of every measure of well-being. And that was how integrated the brain was, using a phrase, how interconnected the connectome was. And the other extreme was every study of someone with a significant psychiatric disorder had impaired integration, not necessarily from anything they experienced with their parents, but just as a sign of unhealth. And then when you do look at attachment experiences of abuse and neglect that are called developmental trauma, the extremes of not helpful parenting, abuse and neglect leads to impaired integration in the brain. And then if you look at how interventions like learning to meditate, do mindfulness meditation, if you had to summarize that on an elevator, the classic elevator speech, you would say mindfulness meditation leads to growth of integration in the brain. And not only does it do that, it allows your whole body to flourish by reducing stress and improving the immune system's functioning, helping the heart function well, reducing systemic inflammation, and actually optimizing an enzyme called telomerase that repairs and maintains the ends of your chromosomes. So if you're here and you're saying to yourself, didn't I just read about the adverse childhood experiences study? ACE, adverse childhood experiences, which at the extreme are developmental trauma, abuse and neglect. But even when it's not extreme, it's situations like a parent who is a substance abuser in the home, who terrifies a child, or experiences of houses falling apart with divorce, or a parent becoming incarcerated. All these, and if you go to on the web, you can find the ACEs questionnaire. People ask, why would childhood adversity lead to medical problems? And the problems that arise often relate to these 5 factors. Stress hormone can be elevated with adversity. Your heart and your head don't work so well together in something called heart rate variability coherence, but that's a second factor. Your immune system may not function so well under those conditions. Inflammation is increased, and you age more quickly because this enzyme that repairs the ends of your chromosomes that keep your cells' genetic machinery working well, that becomes not functioning so optimally. So those are probably, no one's proven this, but those are the likely mechanisms by which adversity in childhood leads to medical problems in adulthood. Now, that being said, many of us have had a high ACEs score from our childhoods. So what I want to say to you about this is the good news is by identifying what the likely mechanisms are of our own childhood adversity, we have an opportunity to do a practice like I call it 3-pillar practice. Mindfulness meditation can be unpacked to say it's learning to focus attention, open awareness, and build kind intention. And I wrote a whole book called Aware that teaches you how to do this, or Becoming Aware, two different books related to a practice where you can learn how to do this. So if you're listening to me and you yourself have had very difficult childhood experiences, the good news is that you can consider doing these 3-pillar practices. Some people just call them mindfulness meditation, but there's a debate about what that word really means. So I call it 3-pillar practice, where you learn to focus attention, open awareness, and strengthen your ability for kindness or kind intention. And those studies show actually can improve factors, not in people who've had a high ACEs score, but just in the general population. You likely will be doing exactly what you need to do to reverse the medical bridge between childhood adversity and adult medical illness by doing something with your mind. So I want to put that out there because a lot of people will hear me give a talk on parenting. And, I wrote a book with my daughter's preschool director, Mary Hartzell, called Parenting from the Inside Out. And it teaches you how to make sense of what happened to you in a way that you'll see can liberate you from bringing that adversity to your childhood, your child's experience. That is, by making sense of your life, what the research shows, you will not pass on this adverse way of communicating with your child to your child. But the second part of this beautiful science story is that you can do a 3-pillar practice training of your mind to very likely, the research hasn't even looked at this yet because it would take decades to show, but as a clinician, as a therapist and a physician, I recommend to all of my clients, all of my patients, everyone I work with who's had adversity, I say to them, the science is pointing to the fact that you will need to do a special way of developing your mind to reverse the very possible biological mechanisms. And these 5 are the likely 5. So you reduce the stress hormone cortisol, you improve immune function, you improve how your heart and your chest communicates with the brain in your head, you decrease inflammation by changing the controls called epigenetic regulators that are controlling inflammation in your body, and you optimize the enzyme telomerase so you can repair as well as maintain the caps on your chromosomes, which keep your cells healthy and you healthy. So I say all this because if there's nothing else that you get from this, if something is arising, you're going, oh my God, I think there's adversity I'm not aware of, do some 3-pillar practice. And if you say, how do I do that? The Aware book is a way to do that. There are lots of apps now that can teach you how to do this. Please take care of yourself. But the second thing, and what we're going to really talk about now, is if I say relational integration leads to neural integration, and you yourself say, hey, I don't know what a relational integration is, but I don't think I had really very optimal experiences when I was a kid. The good news is that you can grow integration in your brain at any age. And a book I wrote called Mindsight talks about even someone who is in his 90s, I call him Stuart, likely grew integration in his brain so much so that his wife of 60 years called me up and she said, Dr. Dan, I don't know what you did with Stuart, but did you give him a brain transplant? Because you can grow your brain at any age. So while we're talking about very serious things, the brain is shaped by experiences, and things we experience early on can have adversity later in our medical health and how long we live. What I'm saying to you, while those are very serious, I'm offering you practical suggestions on, number one, what you can do for your own well-being. And now we're going to focus on what you can do for the well-being of your child. So the research in the field of psychology, which I'm trained in, is called attachment research. And what we do in that field is we study the interactions, the communication patterns of parents and their offspring. There are others that are caregivers as well, and that's called alloparenting. So we as humans have this wonderful situation where the child can be attached to more than just the mother and the father. The child can be attached to other small number of significant attachment figures who are in their life. So that's important to know. We have that. Most mammals don't have that, but we do. It's called allo for other parenting, alloparenting. Okay. So what do we know about these patterns? What does it really mean to have relational communication that's integrative, that the overall picture says relational integration leads to neural integration, which is the basis of all regulation, which is the basis of well-being and resilience. That's the overall model. One way to integrate your brain is to do 3-pillar practice: developing focus, attention, open awareness, kind intention, and now you have a way to do that. But now let's talk about relational integration. What does that really mean? We've defined integration as things being different and then being linked. So let's just talk about a relationship. If you have a partner in your life, a romantic partner or person you're co-parenting with, integration in that relationship would be, how are you allowing yourself to be differentiated, to be different, to be unique, to be specialized, to have downtime and doing your own thing, and then also becoming linked, to spend time together, to be connected, to really hear each other. And in the linkage, you do not lose your differentiation. This is really crucial. So that integration is not like a smoothie. It's not like you're blending things together and mixing them all up, and then the differentiated, fruit, for example, disappear in the smoothie. We're talking more like a fruit salad, right? Where you put the stuff together in the bowl, but you can still see what the different fruit are, each of the fruits. Now, integration is crucial to maintain this differentiated aspects of it when you are linking. Now, let's talk about the relationship you have with your partner. Let's say your child is coming back from preschool, and you have one reaction to how they were treated in preschool, and your partner, she or he or they, have their own reaction to what your child experienced in preschool. And now your child's asleep, and now you're discussing it. Relational integration would allow a sense of differentiation of points of view. Each person would say, here's how I see it. And the other person says, well, here's how I see it, quite differently. And then you say, I can see your point of view is different from mine. I accept that. And we're now going to try to explore, what do we do now with the preschool teacher? Given that we have different points of view, let's explore how we can take both points of view and come up with a plan as a family to communicate with the teacher. So that would be a good example of relational integration, because the different opinions are honored, and now you're coming together to link as a family on what to do. Now, the sense of harmony that arises can say we agree to disagree, for example, or we can come to some joint decision about how to move forward with this. But what would it look like if there wasn't relational integration? It might look something like this. Here's my point of view about what our child experienced in preschool. And then you say, well, that is really stupid. I've never heard of something as ridiculous as that interpretation. And it's really dumb what you're saying. Now, you would not be honoring my differentiated point of view. So of course I would get reactive and say, you're really an idiot. And what you said doesn't make any sense. And you really don't care about our kid. And off to the races we go, either shutting down in rigidity or exploding in chaos. So I'd like you to image a kind of river of well-being, where the optimal flow of the river of integration is harmony. And on one bank outside of the river is chaos. The other bank is rigidity. It's kind of like if you can imagine a choir singing. If we had let's say there were 10 choir members, we bring them up on stage in the days when we were doing this in person, and we say, okay, everyone's singing the same note exactly the same way, and they do, and it's no differentiation. But they're hearing each other, so they're doing the same timing, same note, and it's just rigid. You can totally predict it, unchanging. Now, in the second example, we have them close their ears, think about a song that they might want to sing, and then with their ears tightly shut so they can't hear each other, they belt out a song. And as you can imagine, that would be cacophony or chaos. There's no linkage, only lots of differentiation. So these two examples of rigidity and chaos in this particular case are examples where you didn't allow for differentiation, everyone's singing the same note, or you didn't allow for linkage. Either way, you've impaired integration. Now, in the example, we would have the 10 choir singers get together and say just the following instruction: please sing a song together. That's it. Then we step away, and you don't need a conductor for what's called optimal self-organization, which is what the idea of integration comes from. And that's a mathematical principle we don't need to get into here. But the idea is the choir gets together. In the United States, about 3/4 of the time, they sing Amazing Grace, which, according to Daniel Levitan, is like one of the most harmonious songs in the Western canon of music. And so they sing Amazing Grace, and you feel these chills as the harmony comes through, because they are differentiating their voices while they're also linking. And in the linkage, they don't lose their differentiation. So that would be just a way to get a sense of how relational integration works. Now, with a child, Mary Hartzell and I wrote a book called Parenting from the Inside Out, which teaches you how to build on the research finding that really the best gift you can give to your child is to make sense of how your own childhood experiences either supported your integrative growth or didn't support it. And then looking at emotions and memory and thought and behavior to make sense of your life, literally sensing your life, and also making sense of not only what happened to you, but how did you adapt to what happened to you? So in the book Mary and I wrote, Mary Hartzell, Parenting from the Inside Out, there's a scientifically based view of not just, trauma and neglect, but of more subtle ways in which optimal attachment did not happen. Now, this doesn't mean that your parent is bad or you were bad or anything like that. It just means that something happened to you that has influenced the way your brain has developed, both in its direct impact on your brain and in the way you tried to survive. Those adaptations, some people would call them strategies. Some people would call them defenses. Some people would call them things that shaped your personality. Whatever you want to name it, the idea is exactly the same, that we have a direct impact of experience and we have the way we adapted to that impact of experience. One of the things to name in that process of making sense is the experience of shame. So that when our needs are not being met, we sometimes have a belief that we're defective, and that belief actually has protected us from thinking our parents are not reliable. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but shame is a developmental attempt to survive a childhood rather than realize the parents are not reliable. You look to the self and say the self is defective. So it's a really painful emotion because unlike guilt, where you can feel like I did something wrong and I'm going to correct my behavior, there's no way to correct the defective person deep inside you believe you are. So sadly, shame is an often unrecognized emotional state that goes beneath the surface of consciousness, and yet it can pop out in secondary behaviors. Like if someone points out something they think you didn't do quite as well as you could have, you may react very defensively with anger, because though you did do something wrong, it isn't just that your behavior was wrong and that could be improved in the future. It's that this was revealing something you believe about yourself, that you're defective, which is what the shame feeling is. Your eye gaze turns away. There's a heaviness in the chest. There's all sorts of physiological sensations that go along with shame, but the cognitive belief is I'm damaged goods. There's something wrong with me. Now, the defense against shame is itself something that alienates people because it can be very reactive. It can be something that some people call narcissism, where I begin to externally say to people how great I am, when in fact, deep inside, I actually feel like I'm a piece of garbage. But I don't want anyone to know that because there's nothing I can do about it. So I'm just going to say, oh, I'm great, I'm great. And then we see a narcissistic personality configuration and all the ways it can impact us personally or publicly or politically or however you might see it in the world. So shame is an important thing to name as we dive into this. So the first thing about this is in the book, Parenting from the Inside Out, Mary and I wanted to lay out all of these basic steps of how you yourself as a parent could make sense of your life, because the research on attachment shows that it isn't so much what happened to you that's going to influence the development of your child's attachment to you. It's not what happened to you. It's how you've made sense of what happened to you. So when parents have had horrible things happen to them and they've made sense of them, they don't pass on that horrible pattern to their kids, amazingly. But if horrible things have happened to them, or not so horrible things, but suboptimal things, then there's a high likelihood, if that adult has not taken the time to make sense of their life and what happened to them, they'll pass it on. So the good news about that is, if you're hearing me speak about this, I hope that it motivates you to say, yeah, my childhood was not so great, so let me do something about it. It isn't just we're saying, oh, your childhood was not so great. Oh, too bad for you. No, it's your childhood was not so great. Use that as an opportunity to grow. And there are ways to do that. Parenting from the Inside Out is it's a workbook that teaches you how to do that. Now, let's move to not only our own understanding of our parenting experience when we were kids and how it now influenced our adolescence and our adulthood, all the way to our being parents. Now we're going to say, what are the patterns that research has shown lead to secure attachment versus non-secure attachment? Now, in different cultures, there are different patterns of parenting, and these studies have been done across cultures. So this is not to say one way is better than the other. However, there is a way of looking at a child's well-being and going across cultures and saying that whether it's the adult version, which is in a study called the Adult Attachment Interview, which I describe in these various books, where making sense of your childhood is exactly what that research says you should do. Now we're going to look at your relationship with your child, not just your relationship with yourself from the past, and making sense of that, which is step number one. Step number two is to say, okay, if I had really difficult things, I'm going to make sense of my childhood, fine. I'm going to do the 3-pillar practice. So I'm going to try to reverse what the likely negative impacts on my medical health might be. So those are all action items from today's talk for you to actually do. And there you can, do it however you want to do it. But one resource would be Parenting from the Inside Out for making sense of your life. And then the Aware book for doing 3-pillar practice. So now let's look at what are the relational integration patterns you can start bringing to your child. So one of my students first came to me when she was a student, Tina Payne Bryson, when she had a 6-month-old. And now she has 3 sons, not just the first, who are in their mid to late adolescence. So what Tina and I ended up doing is writing 4 parenting books: The Whole Brain Child, No Drama Discipline, The Yes Brain, and The Power of Showing Up. And in the middle of all that, I wrote a book when my kids were through their adolescence called Brainstorm. So those are the different parenting books. But what I'll do is summarize those books for you in a nutshell, which is basically to say that the way you offer connection to your child in the form of communication, where you honor the differences of what your child is bringing to you versus what your expectations are. So you really see your child for who they are, accept them for who they are, but help guide them to develop integrative ways of being in the world. That essentially is a summary of an entire field called attachment research, which is different, by the way, from parenting approaches that use that same name, attachment, that have nothing to do with attachment research. So I just want you to be careful that just because someone's using the word attachment, it doesn't mean they are using attachment science. They may just be using the word. So be very, very careful about that, because some of the suggestions in some of those approaches are actually opposite to what health needs. For example, saying the mother is the only attachment figure is absolutely against the science of attachment of human beings, and makes many mothers feel guilty if they have others support the development of their child, which is actually how we evolved to grow. And there are many mothers that have come to me who are taking one of those approaches that say, you know, the mother is the only person, and it's just not true. That's one example of a distorted use of the term attachment. Okay, so what do we know? So in these books that Tina and I wrote, or the Brainstorm book that I wrote, what they tell you basically is your communication pattern with your child is going to stimulate the growth of integration within the child's brain. And then integration in the child's brain is the basis for your child developing well-being and resilience. That's the overarching idea. And each of those books has step-by-step practical ways for you to actually start applying this in your own parenting. So those are resources available to you. What I'm going to do now is summarize 2 of the major themes. One is that you can help grow integration in your child's brain across what I call domains of integration. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. But the second is how you can have a very simple memory tool that helps you summarize attachment research, the science of attachment, so that you know the fundamental principles that you can start imparting in your patterns of communicating. And let's start with that, and then we'll get into the integration of your child's brain. So in The Power of Showing Up, and summarized in Parenting from the Inside Out, and the science of this explored in the Developing Mind. So if you like to read, there's tons of reading you can do. But the summary is 4 S's. The 4th S, which we'll get to, is called security of attachment. And what this is, in about 55 to 65% of the population, is kids are developing in their primary relationship with that caregiver a way of feeling grounded in who they are, meeting their intellectual potential, having a positive attitude about life, being able to connect with other people, their teachers, their peers, making friendships that are mutually rewarding, being able to regulate their emotions, being able to think clearly under stress. If you like that list I just gave you, those are the outcomes of secure attachment. So you could basically say, isn't that how a child is thriving and has resilience? And I would say, yes. Now, do the factors that we call temperament, do they influence a child's way of being in the world? Absolutely. One of the next books I'm writing is all about how the genetically influenced temperamental factors we have in childhood move with us through adolescence and then influence our adult personality. So, I deeply believe in understanding temperament. And on top of that, we have secure attachment. So the key is that whatever temperament your child may have, the first S is that you keep them safe, right? So some kids are very energized and energetic. They're running around a lot. Your job is to keep them safe. It's one of the primary roles of us as attachment figures. And it's one reason in our complex world, we need more than one caregiver, because, a kid can be endangered in all sorts of ways. So safety has two components. One is that you want them to be safe, physically safe. But the second, that's often not talked about safety, is that we need to not be the source of terror in our child's life. So what would that mean? It means if you're coming home from work and you had a horrible day and you're screaming at the top of your lungs, you may not be screaming at your child, but you're just out of control. That can terrify your child. And that can be very disorganizing in your child's development to see you out of control. You can come home drunk and not hit your child or not do anything directly to your child, but your child seeing you inebriated like that, that can be very terrifying for your child. Clearly, things directly aimed at someone like domestic abuse, where one caregiver is abusing another caregiver and the child witnesses that, or obviously witnessing another child being abused, or the child themselves being abused or neglected, those are all forms of terror that are created because of the parents' behaviors. So if we look into the brain, we see that the brain is going to have two reactions to that. One reaction is that they are able to see that they're in a state of terror, so they have to run away from that source of terror, a very deep protective reaction to get away from what's scaring you. But the other is a mammalian network that says, I'm being terrified. I need to go toward my attachment figure to be protected. So how in the world, with one body, can you go both away from the source of terror and toward the attachment figure, who is the source of terror, you? The brain fragments. And that leads to what's called disorganized attachment, which unfortunately has a negative impact on all those different features we talked about. Regulating your emotions, having mutually rewarding relationships, thinking clearly under stress. And so this is something we want to avoid. And we want to make sure to say out front that while any of us, including people who've written books on the subject, and it's why I put examples of times I've terrified my kids in the books I write, and my kids see this to their dismay. They say, yeah, it's accurate. But why do you want to let the world know what a jerk you can be, they say. And I said, because the key is that there is no such thing as perfect parenting. There's just parental presence where we can recognize a rupture in the way we wanted our connection to go, and then we make a repair. And in fact, it's so important to be kind to ourselves, because if you're beating yourself up for what you did unintentionally, you're much less likely to make a repair. So while we want to reduce the amount of times we do things that are terrifying to our kids, we want to recognize when we do them and make a repair as quickly as possible. We also want to reduce the intensity of it and really come to use it as an opportunity to understand what's going on. But the repair process is so important, not just for this first S, but for the other S's, as you'll see. Safety is our first S. The second S is seen, S-E-E-N. And this is basically where the child has a very integrative experience where you are looking beneath their behavior to ask the question, what is going on in the mental life of my child? Their feelings, their thoughts, their point of view or perspective, their memories, their hopes, dreams, longings, desires. All of this and more, we're going to call the mind, the mental life of the child. And the mental life of the child, or the mental life of any of us, is what's beneath behavior. When I was in medical school, I noticed my professors only dealt with the external sort of material nature of the world, treating patients, for example, like bags of biochemicals. And they didn't recognize that their patients or their students had a subjective life of feelings or the meaning when they were told they were dying of what that would do to their life. It was quite remarkable. But it turns out that we have two different perceptual capacities, one to see the physical world, the other to see the world of the mind. And I just named that mind sight. So mind sight is the ability to be seen. You know, when a child's parent shows mind sight, the child has the experience that a patient of mine named so beautifully a long time ago, feeling felt. This is how we join as a we when our mind is seen beneath the behavior that's on the outside, that's observable with the eyes. Mind sight, you feel many ways with your heart. You feel it with aspects of your brain. You feel it by focusing attention on the internal world. And that's what we do. We attune to the internal world. So when those don't happen ideally, we can make a repair. Remember, repair, repair, repair. It's the key to parenting. There's no such thing as parental perfection. There's simply showing up with parental presence. The third S is soothed, S-O-O-T-H-E-D. And what this means is that when the child is in a state of distress, depending on our own childhood histories and also our own temperament, that distress can come inside of us through a set of neurons that act like sponges. They're called mirror neurons, but I think of them as sponge neurons. We sponge up the emotions of someone else. And if we don't have the kind of clarity of mind, this kind of hub of a wheel of awareness that you'll learn in the 3-pillar practice, if you do that book Aware, you know, where you develop the capacity to hold whatever emotions your child is experiencing. If you don't have that ability, then what's going to happen is your child will experience they're distressed, you're freaking out at their distress, they freak out some more, you freak out more, and you're off to the races in a non-integrative way. You're fusing with your child, and that's confusing to your child. So while empathy includes emotional resonance like that, empathy also includes the ability to be differentiated and to say, what's going on with my child, not become your child. So this ability to soothe means if I'm a distressed child, you as my parent will keep me safe, you'll see me. And the soothing part is in connecting with me, you're differentiating and linking. So there's the integrative piece. You are helping me go from a state of being alone in my distress to joined, and that feels incredibly comforting. And that's where the soothing comes in. When you have on a reliable basis the experience of being safe, seen, and soothed, then you develop the fourth S of security. And this security involves also a way maybe a fifth S, we've made sense making of our experiences. Now, the final thing I'll just say before we get ready to close for today is that these four S's, you know, being safe, being seen, being soothed, and then being secure, they're not a guarantee of anything, but they're the best we can do as parents to help build what Carol Dweck would call like a growth mindset, where you want your child to say, I can take on challenges and they don't reveal my failures. They're just opportunities to learn more, rather than a fixed mindset, which says, oh my God, this is terrible. I'm really a bad person. So that resilience that comes from a growth mindset that, you know, Angela Duckworth might say is a form of grit, allows us to have a kind of internal compass that drives us forward with persistence, patience, and resilience. And when we look at these ways of parenting, you know, the thing I hope you're getting a sense of is, you know, the guiding principle for you is integration. Because integration, and this is really what Tina Payne Bryson and I tried to do in all of our books. But basically, if you look at the developing mind, you'll see there are 9 domains of integration. This is kind of the science behind all those other books. You know, the science basically tells us that there are lots of ways of integrating your life. In the Mindsight book, for example, you'll see case examples of people working on different domains. So these resources are available to you to do something, for example, integrating consciousness, which is where you're realizing I can differentiate my awareness from what I'm aware of and be open to whatever emotions arise, anger, happiness, fear, excitement, whatever. When you integrate consciousness, like the Rumi poem, The Guest House, you allow it all in. You can also integrate across your left and right side of your brain, you know, where when you look at the science of the brain, not just what people are saying about the science, but the actual science, there are different processes in the left and different processes in the right. And honoring these differences and bringing them together allows a creative and rewarding collaborative mind to emerge. You can also learn how to integrate from top to bottom, to be aware of your body in something called interoception. This allows you to get to the wisdom of the body more than just the rational way we usually think with the head. There's also things called memory integration and narrative integration, where we make sense of experience in different layers of memory. And narrative is the way we take those events and put them together and develop a kind of internal compass that guides our life. And kids who have parents who talk about the mind in something called reflective dialogues actually develop this incredible integrative capacity to make sense of life through narrative and this state integration, to know that they have different aspects of themselves. And so this integrative capacity happens in many, many layers of our own lives, and we can facilitate it in our kids. And then finally, these last 3 domains of integration I'll just mention. So we've covered all 9 actually briefly. They include something called relational integration, which is basically what we've been talking about. How do you honor the difference with your partner or with your child that they're experiencing, but then link together because you're interested in what's going on inside their mind, right? This is where Mindsight facilitates this kind of relational integration. And then temporal integration is how, across time, we come to realize that, my gosh, we don't live forever. Things are impermanent, right? They're transient. How do we actually take these existential issues of life? I want life to go on forever. Oh, but it doesn't. I want to live forever. Oh, but we're not going to. And he even realized that there's a way of living in time where time we know is finite, and yet on another level, as I talk about in Aware, there is no such thing as time. So that's temporal integration. And finally, what I want to end with is something called identity integration. And this is, I think, where we've come with the pandemics we've been in, not only the pandemic of a virus, but the pandemic of the realization that's been here for hundreds of years of social injustice and racism, the pandemic of misinformation and the polarization we're experiencing, and the pandemic of the climate catastrophe, the climate crisis we're in. I think each of those pandemics are either worsened by or caused by a 5th pandemic, which I'll just name. And I think it's the pandemic of the lie of the separate self. That in modern culture, we take this word self, S-E-L-F, and we equate it with the body. Just like in the time of Hippocrates on 2,500 years, we've equated mind with the brain in the head. These views of a separate self, a solo self, are not only misguided, maybe they're partial truths, but the self, our experience of subjectivity and perspective and agency, this way you can spa the self, this fundamentals of self, is not just limited to it by our skull or our skin. And if we raise youth, young children, adolescents, even ourselves, to realize that the self is actually capable of being integrated beyond just the differentiated, isolated me, we realize we're also a we, connected to one another as a human family, but also connected within nature, intra-connected within nature. And when you put those together for an integrated identity, you get me, the differentiated interior experience of self, very important to enjoy it, to develop it, understand it. That's me. But we're also a we. Our self is also a we. To put them together, you go me plus we is we. And we is an integrated identity. I think we can move toward as we come out of these challenging times and say, can we live our way in modern life to heal these pandemics and move towards a more integrative way of living? And as parents, we're in a very important role to do just that. And we thank you for being here, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future.